crisis in Ukraine and its implications to international system and US leadership around the world. And today we have a distinguished set of panelists to discuss this issue. For the last, I think, it has been since 2014, 2015, this crisis has been a significant deterrent in Russian relations with the Western countries. For the last, I think, Kadir, I think you are kind of turning on your volume. For the last 2 months now, we have been witnessing a speedy escalation in the crisis. And both United States, NATO countries, Ukrainian government, and of course, United States are releasing statements one after another, trying to deter each other from taking an action against each other, and especially towards Ukraine. And we have been seeing and reading reports about increasing troop movements and troop deployment of the Russian military to Ukrainian border. And today with three panelists, we will discuss what is happening in the region and how could it change the dynamics, especially in terms of geopolitics in Europe, NATO-Russia relations, Black Sea, and US-Russia relations. And we will start with Ambassador Pfeiffer. The bios of the panelists are available in our advertisement, so I will not go there. And Ambassador Pfeiffer was in Ukraine recently. So let's start with you, Mr. Ambassador, and tell us your observations about what is going on in the region.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I mean, obviously within Ukraine, they are very conscious of this Russian military buildup that has been going now for more than 2 months and actually continues. And includes, for example, not only substantial Russian deployments into Crimea. It sounds like there's been a doubling, if not a tripling, of Russian ground forces in Crimea. And what's happened that is somewhat new in the past couple of weeks is you've seen Russian force deployments into Belarus, ostensibly for exercises. But I think there's our concern that those forces could give the Russians the option of a new attack corridor against Ukraine, including a possible threat against Kyiv if the Russians wanted to do a really high-end operation. And I think also that presence in Belarus is of concern to NATO because it puts that Russian force buildup closer to allies such as Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania. And that's likely one of the reasons why you saw this morning the US decision to deploy about 2,000 troops from the United States to Poland and Germany, and then to move troops from Germany, about 1,000 troops from Germany to Romania. So I think the Ukrainians are very conscious of all of this. Now, my sense was that, one, they are nervous, obviously. They've been watching this go on, but they're not panicked. I mean, bear in mind that Ukrainians have been facing a Russian military threat now really since 2014, when Russia used military force to seize Crimea and then instigated and then has sustained this conflict in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, which now is in its 8th year and has claimed more than 13,000, I think something like 14,000 lives. So they're used to that. Their expectation when they look at the Russian military force, my sense is they tend to not see a realistic threat of a massive Russian invasion aimed at occupying a large part of the country, but they tend to suspect that the Russians will look at smaller force operations. What I was struck by, though, is though that there will be strong resistance, not only for the Ukrainian military, which in some ways will be overmatched against the Russians. They don't, for example, have the same air power, but I got a sense of determination. And then it goes beyond that, the creation, which is now underway, of territorial defense forces and planning essentially for civilian resistance. And I do very much hope that that in the Kremlin, they do not miscalculate, that they appreciate just how much resistance there would be from organized military, but also from civilians to a Russian military, a new Russian military incursion. I would close with one observation at the end. We heard this from a couple of our Ukrainian interlocutors when we were there on Sunday and Monday, was they said, look, in Ukraine, when people panic, they panic buy. And he says, the first thing that they panic buy in Ukraine is salt. He says, when people are panicking, you will not find salt in Ukrainian stores. And they then said, go to the stores now and you'll see plenty of salt. What you will not find are bullets.
Kilich, you're on mute.
I will have some follow-up questions, of course, just Ambassador. But before that, Charles, can you tell us about U.S. policy? And since you were in the administration in 2014 when the invasion actually took place, how do you think the U.S. policy evolved, and how do you evaluate Biden administration policy towards this crisis right now?
Thanks, Kilich. Nice to to join you and Steve and Kadir today. I'll make three quick points. The first point is that I think the crisis that we are seeing today does go back to not just 2014 with the Maidan revolution and Ukraine's decision to look west rather than to Russia, but really earlier, back to the beginning of the enlargement of NATO in the 1990s. And to some extent, we're seeing the culmination of Russian disaffection and discontent with the continuing enlargement of NATO, which has been going on for the last 2+ decades. And it's coming to a head in Ukraine, in part because of the long history between Ukraine and Russia, in part because Russia, whether justified or not, feels uncomfortable with the prospect of NATO membership for Ukraine. I think that if there is to be some kind of meeting of the mind, some kind of diplomatic resolution, it would stem from the reality that NATO membership for Ukraine is, if anything, far, far off. I think it's Steve who may have coined the phrase "not now, not never." But the administration has said explicitly that NATO membership for Ukraine is not on the table. It's not under discussion, and the Russians want a legal guarantee. And I say that I think there should be some kind of diplomatic middle ground, some kind of language that everybody can live with. Now, whether the Russians are would accept an understanding as opposed to a legal guarantee remains to be seen. But it seems to me that this crisis is to some extent being manufactured. And that when Russia says, well, there are nuclear missiles coming in, NATO poses a threat to Ukraine, to Russia. The reality is that the United States and its NATO allies have been quite restrained in their armaments provided to Ukraine. And since membership in NATO, it requires a consensus of all 30 parties, I think it's safe to say that the issue of Ukrainian membership is simply not now on the table and is likely to be so for the foreseeable future. So is there a diplomatic resolution that we can find on that? I hope so. Second point, I think the Biden administration's response so far has been correct, more or less on target. And that is tireless, dogged diplomacy. I mean, for the past several weeks, every day, there has been either a US-Russia dialogue, a NATO-Russia dialogue, a Normandy format. One leader after another is showing up in Kyiv. Kilich, you mentioned before the call that Erdogan is about to go. So the diplomacy is taking place. Draft documents are being passed back and forth. And at the same time that the Biden administration is leaning into diplomacy, it is also putting in the window far-reaching economic sanctions and taking the military steps that Steve mentioned to bolster the eastern flank of NATO, simply because if Putin does invade Ukraine, it does raise questions about what his intentions are for NATO's eastern flank. Do I think that there can also be common ground on a broader conversation about nuclear arms control, conventional arms control, transparency, military exercises in the zone between NATO and Russia? Yes. And I think that's where, in some ways, the passing back and forth of documents may have been most fruitful. My final point, and maybe Steve could comment on this, I have a hard time envisaging what military option gets Putin what he wants. Because a smaller use of force, let's say he annexes Donbass, he expands separatist control in Donbass, he connects Donbass to Crimea. Okay, he gets a little bit, but he then ends up further alienating Ukraine. On the other hand, if he wants to keep Ukraine in the Russian fold, if you will, he's really going to have to go whole hog. It seems to me he would need to effect regime change. Does Russia have the stomach for that? Does Putin really think it would be a win for him to move on a country of some 40 million people, occupy it, deal with a potential insurgency of average Ukrainians? They may now be concerned about SALT, but my guess is if they were occupied by Russia, they would do other things. And so the fact that I don't see a clear military option that works for Putin leaves me hopeful, not optimistic, but hopeful that we can see a diplomatic de-escalation. And my final point would be, I also think it's interesting that the Olympics are about to start. I'm guessing that Xi Jinping would not be particularly happy if Vladimir Putin starts the biggest war in Europe since World War II and reigns on his party.
Kilis, could I make a couple additional comments?
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think Charles has made some excellent points there. I agree. This is a manufactured crisis, and I've actually come to the conclusion that it is as much about Ukraine, or perhaps even more about Ukraine, than about NATO enlargement. I would make 2 points. 5 NATO members today border Russian territory or the Russian exclave in Kaliningrad. The last one of those NATO members to join the alliance joined in 2004. The enlargement that has taken place since 2004, the addition of 4 new countries, they all come from the Balkans. They're all at least 1,000 kilometers away from Russia. So why are we having this crisis now as opposed to 7 or 3 or 11 years ago? The second point I would make on this not now, but not never is, it's clear that there is no enthusiasm today within NATO to put Ukraine on a membership track. And the Russians know that. If they don't know that, it's been a huge intelligence failure on their part. They simply don't understand. So again, I think the timing here suggests to me that this is equally or more about Ukraine than about NATO. The second point, I agree completely with Charles that the Biden administration has laid out the correct approach. It's a combination of deterrence, outlining costs that would be imposed on Russia if the Russians use military force for a new invasion of Ukraine, but also holding open the diplomatic channel. And as you may have seen, I think the Spanish newspaper El País has come out and now leaked 2 documents that are purportedly the written US response to the Russian draft treaty from last December and the NATO response to the Russian proposed draft agreement from December. At least the US language, quite frankly, as a former US official for 27 years, looks to me authentic. What that entails, though, it outlines a rich menu of arms control, transparency, confidence building measures that the United States, NATO, and Russia could discuss, which should ease security concerns on both sides, and also even opens up the possibility of a dialogue on broader European security questions, although it's pretty clear the United States will adhere to certain principles. It's not going to forswear further NATO enlargement, and it's not, and nor will NATO, I believe, agree to withdraw forces from those countries that joined the alliance after 1997. The third point, again, is it also is hard for me to see what kind of military option achieves Russian political objectives. As Charles said, I mean, to effect regime change, Russia basically has to occupy a large portion of the country. And anybody that they installed would have zero authority with 90% of the Ukrainian population. You would see, I think, protests, you would see violent action, and to the extent the Russians would have to stay there to support that regime. And that then opens up, even if they manage to defeat the Ukrainian military, again, all of those bullets are gone from the stores because Ukrainians are prepared to take up arms. And it's going to be, I think, a very miserable experience for the Russian military. And this sort of, I think, sort of fits into, it's not going to achieve the Russian goal of bringing Ukraine back into Moscow's orbit. It's actually going to do what Russian policy has done for the last 8 years, which is to push Ukraine away, to push Ukraine towards the West, and to raise interest in Ukraine in joining institutions such as NATO. Likewise, Russian policy, if it entails a further military invasion, is going to see what I think you've seen over the last 2 months, which is a further galvanizing of NATO unity. Again, it seems to me that this policy the Russians are pursuing is a failure when put in the context of what Russian interests are.
Thank you very much, Steve. And Kadir, Turkey has been very vocal in its opposition to Russia to annex Crimea. But at the same time, Turkey is having good relations with Russia, and at the same time, good relations with Ukraine. So President Erdogan will visit Ukraine tomorrow, and the reports are indicating that President Putin may visit Ankara very soon. So tell us about Turkey's position in this crisis and how, from Ankara's perspective, what is happening in the region, how Ankara is reading it.
Thank you, Kılıç. As you know, Turkey is a NATO member. People sometimes forget about that. We need to remind people, and Turkey has very complicated but strong relations with both countries, in Russia and Ukraine. And Turkey actually strongly supports has supported, at least in the past, supported the membership of Georgia and Ukraine in NATO. So in terms of, and just a couple of days ago, President Erdogan reaffirmed Turkey's, commitment to NATO agreements regarding Russia's recent moves. But at the same time, Turkey also proposed to find, some sort of diplomatic solution, maybe mediate between the two sides, because as you said, Erdogan has good relations with Zelensky and Putin. So it is, in some ways, timing has been debated a lot in recent days and weeks about why Putin is doing it now. I think one obvious thing is, Biden administration. This started in April, and then there were sort of Russian buildup was in April and October. It increased much more. And if you remember, under Trump administration, there were serious sort of questioning of NATO alliance by President Trump himself, reportedly. But there were serious questions about NATO's internal, sort of cohesion, whether in case of a crisis, whether it could unite and create a common front, etc. And in many ways, Putin is testing this. And so far, at the rhetorical level and diplomatic level, I think NATO is passing that. But if there's an invasion, like Biden was speaking out loud just recently, and how that invasion happens, and then the real test will come then. We'll see if there are real deep frictions within the NATO alliance. So that's the NATO angle for Turkey, and Turkey will probably avoid imposing severe sanctions against Russia because that would be basically punishing Turkey itself. I'm just guessing here, so I'm not sure, but that's been the kind of behavior of Turkey when it comes to sanctions. As you said, Crimea's annexation has never been accepted. Turkey called it illegal multiple times, and it retains its sort of commitment to territorial integrity of Ukraine. And interestingly, like you said, Erdogan is supposed to visit Ukraine, I believe tomorrow, very soon. And that's part of a high-level strategic dialogue with Ukraine. And those relations, they're even talking about signing free trade agreement. I don't know if it's going to happen this week or it will be delayed because of the current crisis. But Turkey's relations with Ukraine is quite strong, includes some defense relationships as well. So when you look at Turkey's relations with Russia, that's also very, diverse. There is a defense relationship, a limited defense relationship at least. There is, huge trade relations between the two countries. And then all the, Syria, Libya, South Caucasus, Turkey has been at odds with Russia often. It has even competed with Russia. It has, worked against Russian interests, and Russia did the same, but they were able to continue their dialogue and diplomatic relations, etc. So I expect that to continue in case of invasion or enlarging of the Russian invasion from Crimea. But Crimea in particular, that is not discussed very much, right? We've been hearing a lot about Eastern Europe and European security, but also this relates to Black Sea. The changing of the status quo in the Black Sea region can, create new tensions potentially, because since the annexation of Crimea by Russia, now Russia has more of a foothold in the Black Sea region. So these are kind of main concerns for Turkey, but going forward, I think they'll continue to emphasize diplomacy and try to, mediate between the two. But if things get really much hotter in terms of military, then, we'll see how much NATO can sustain that united front. Right now, it's been able to do so, but I'm not sure how much that's going to last, given Germany's hesitations and reservations about confronting Russia.
Thank you. And for those, I started to receive some questions from social media to our panelists. And for those who are in the Zoom, actually, if you have any question, you can raise your hand or just write your question to Q&A box so that I can direct the question to our panelists. Steve, there are two questions. Actually, I will try to merge them together. The question is about the analogies and how correct are the analogies, because there have been analogies on social media about an model. It uses a military option. What happened between 1979 to 1987? A Georgia model, which Russia will basically have a kind of two different regions under its control, and a Kadyrov model. Somebody mentioned Kadyrov model in Chechnya, appointing someone or working with a person loyal to Moscow with Ukraine. You mentioned the difficulty of these options for Russia, actually, but can you elaborate a little more on that? Some of our listeners are asking that.
I'm sorry, could you mention that I heard the Georgia model and the Kadyrov model. What was the first model?
Afghanistan, like if Russia starts an invasion, would it face the same consequence that it faced in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I actually think that, first of all, there would be armed resistance by the Ukrainian military. Again, in certain ways, the Ukrainian military would be overmatched by Russian military capabilities, for example, air power, long-range strike capabilities. But I do believe the Ukrainian military would resist. And again, to the extent that the Russians occupied territory, I think they would need to have a very significant concern about a partisan campaign. There was a poll that was taken, I guess, about 3 weeks ago in Ukraine that said that 1/3 of those asked were planned to take up arms if the Russian military came into Ukraine again. And that, it was interesting, it included 25% of those asked in eastern Ukraine, which typically is seen as the part of Ukraine a bit more sympathetic to the Russians. Now, part of that could be just bravado, but I think there really is. I've had some conversation with Ukrainians. I mean, they intend, if the Russians cross the line, they're going to go find a place to get an AK-47 and join the battle. And so, there is a real potential. Well, I'm sure the Russian military and the Kremlin, if they do, and at this point, I still do not think Vladimir Putin has made a decision. And the good news there is it gives the West and the Ukrainians further opportunity to make clear that the costs of making a decision to use military force now would be extremely high. But while the Russian military might propose a quick strike, get in and out very quickly, there's this saying that says no military plan ever survived contact with the adversary. And the Russians might find themselves bogged down in a quagmire and in a situation where, any convoy moving through a city to resupply forces might find itself subject to attack at any time. So I think potentially this could be a very ugly situation for the Russians. And I hope when they decide what they're eventually going to do with this military force, they do bear in mind, because a Russian decision to use military force against Ukraine, that would be a tragedy for Ukraine, but I think it could also be a tragedy for Russia and for many Russian families who would find that their sons, husbands, and brothers would not be coming home.
Another follow-up question, since you mentioned the Ukrainian public, how about the Russian public? I received 2 questions, one from...
I'm sorry, you froze.
Another question from Zoom now. Albert Goldson is asking, how does Russia save face for its citizenry if decides to demobilize and withdraw from Ukrainian border?
Well, on the Russian public, the polls show that the Russians, I think, support the strong stand that Vladimir Putin has taken. That appeals. The question, though, to my mind is, will that still appeal if they begin to see the real cost of that, including dead Russian soldiers? I don't think Vladimir Putin cares much about the fate of individual Russian soldiers, but I do think he cares a lot about how that affects public opinion, and that's very important to the Kremlin regime. How does Russia get out of this? Well, I mean, one advantage that Moscow has domestically is they control all the major methods of mass communication. So they can spin this. And if Moscow wants to, they can portray what's on the table now as a victory. The West has heard us. The West is prepared to address our real security concerns. We don't want off American missiles in Ukraine. They're going to negotiate on that. And we won't see that threat. And they could even spin, the readiness for a conversation on European security more broadly, which was in the American paper. And we have a chance to talk about that. So I think if the Kremlin wants to domestically, it can wind this down in a way that doesn't look too embarrassing. Although I am concerned that the longer the Kremlin avoids taking that step, the more they paint themselves into a corner where they may leave military action their only option.
I would just add that, I completely agree with Steve. And we've seen Putin change the narrative, and he can do it almost overnight. He switches from Ukraine to Syria to Nagorno-Karabakh, and he does have a remarkable control over the media, and that does give him a lot of leeway. And in some ways, I think the real story here is the Ukrainian public. And Steve was right to say that, if there is already a sense of who lost Ukraine? Well, Putin did, because you now have a country that for most of its history was divided between East and West, did not have a strong national identity. Some wanted to go this way, others wanted to go that way. And now you have Poroshenko on the opposition, Zelensky, the president. They're all pro-West. They're all, they put membership in NATO in the Ukrainian constitution. And so given that this is a consequence of Russian aggression, it's hard for me to see how more Russian aggression fixes this problem. It makes the problem worse. And that's why I have I understand Putin's broader agenda here. What I don't understand is what his game is in Ukraine itself.
Yeah, what Charles said, I go back to a comment. This was in 2014 or 2015 that I heard from a Ukrainian who said, Vladimir Putin has done more than centuries of Ukrainian nationalists to unite the country, to give it a strong sense of national identity. And moreover, he's imbued that sense of national identity now with a strong anti-Russian bias. Again, I think, the policy pursued by the Kremlin over the past 8 years has been a total failure in terms of the Russian goal to pull Ukraine back.
And that's why even if he were to install a puppet, that regime would have so little support among the Ukrainian population that, how long would it last?
Charles, last week, this is a question, but last week I see probably, at least 3-4 articles stating that US never understood Putin. Do you agree with that statement? There were arguments that US administrations from Bush administration to all the way to Biden administration miscalculated or misunderstood Putin. Would you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that. I think that, going back to the Obama administration and during the reset, when Putin was not in the driver's seat completely, there was an open question about what way Russia would go. But really, since Putin came back to the presidency, he has been making trouble. And then I think 2014 was a turning point. Georgia less so, for reasons we can talk about, but 2014 was a real turning point. And then interference in Western elections, hacking into US computer systems, supporting a regime in Syria that gasses its own people. No, I think the US has a pretty good assessment of him. I think the bigger problem is getting the leverage needed to stop him. And that's because, as Biden has said, we're not going to go to war for Ukraine. No US combat troops. There are 100 trainers there. The most powerful weapon we've provided them is a javelin. We're clearly, treading lightly in terms of avoiding a war with Russia in Ukraine. That having been said, the question is what combination of economic punishment, of reinforcement of NATO, of diplomatic isolation is enough to stop him? We don't know the answer to that. And it certainly matters. Two things I think matter a lot. One is China, which gives Putin a lot of cover and emboldens him. And the other is gas. And we have seen over the last few weeks a German government that perhaps is not as forthright as it should be on this question. And that's, I think, in part because Europe is heavily dependent on imports of gas from Russia, and there is concern about what happens if he turns off the flow.
Okay, just one question, Charles, before I pass to Kadir. Do you think this would change, this crisis would change, especially the recent escalation change, the foreign policy direction of United States? Because when I look at interim strategic, national strategic security strategic guidance, actually, there was this, for the first time, I saw that the US administration is making a basically kind of drawing a line between China and Russia, and calling China the technological, military, and economic threat, and calling Russia a little more, not a rival, but a great disruptor type of characterization. I think it really disrupted and disoriented US foreign policy and made US focus less on Asia and focus more, again, its traditional areas such as Black Sea, NATO, etc.
I do think that if Putin invades, it will change American grand strategy in the sense that Biden really does want to focus on China. Mm-hmm. Understandably, in my mind, right? Russia has an economy smaller than the size of Italy. It has not invested in high tech. It doesn't have a knowledge economy. It's got an economy heavily dependent on energy revenue. In China, you have a country that will sometime soon have the world's largest economy, and it's got a world-class high-tech sector. So it's a much greater weight in the world than Russia looking forward. But if we see a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think we're looking at something that looks a lot like a Cold War, in which there would be a remilitarization of the border between NATO and countries to the east, and in which the effort to focus on China would really be diluted in some ways by a renewed focus on Russia. And frankly, I think another cost here, and maybe this is part of Putin's motivation, is it would make it harder for Biden to focus his attention on the domestic front. And, I think we would all agree that there are important domestic priorities here. And especially with the midterms coming, it will be hard to address a lot of those priorities if Russia has just invaded and occupied Ukraine.
Village, can I add something to what Charles said? Well, I think this is, I don't believe that Biden will have the luxury of turning to domestic agenda, to be honest, because this was part of his big platform, right? To rejuvenate the Western alliance and, organize it, and in a way to counter new challenges, especially China. And there was a bit of a, pushback by the Europeans saying, well, we don't want a new Cold War against China or Russia. But now Putin's sort of actions are testing, right? Testing whether Biden can actually deliver on that united front. And as I mentioned at the beginning, he has been able to some extent at least, but he also aired internal, counters of internal discussions about how some allies might be hesitant in case of an invasion by Putin. And I think that tells me that, Biden will be at a much more difficult situation. I agree. He outlined, he's done the right things in terms of, reassuring NATO allies, recent deployments, did a lot of diplomacy, back and forth. It's been very busy. But if Russia tries to escalate, and I agree that it doesn't have a lot of interest in probably escalating right now, but this will come back. I believe even if there was some sort of lowering of tensions in the months ahead, until sort of Putin feels like he was able to have that veto power over the Western alliance's foreign policy decisions, or a NATO enlargement. I think this will come back, and that will be a test of Biden. But after Afghanistan, pulling out of Afghanistan, the last week, 10 days of that was really difficult times for the administration. Now this is kind of the chance to prove for the Biden administration that the West is going to be able to unite in front of, and this is a security threat not in faraway lands, right? Not in Afghanistan. This is Europe. This is what NATO was created to defend. So this is a time for him to prove that. And I'm not sure about if Putin escalates further. And of course, America has been providing Ukraine with arms and support, and it will be very, very difficult for Russia to achieve a significant, swift victory in Ukraine. I agree. But, I'm not sure how, when those cracks happen within the alliance, within the Western alliance, if they do, I don't know how Biden administration will be able to manage them in an environment where military tensions are high and Russian troops are moving into Ukraine, etc. And I'm sure America will be able to make it very costly for Russia, but I'm not sure if the broader goal for me would be to for the administration to achieve that Western unity. And I'm not sure if it's going to be able to do that, to create this new NATO concept, right? It's been this debated, like we've been talking about whether NATO, some people even ask NATO lost its relevance, etc. But with this crisis, we are seeing that that's not true. What is the new mission, right? What's this new strategic sort of direction of NATO and the Western alliance?
Steve, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted, I think if you went back to September or October, it was clear that the strategic focus of the Biden administration was on China, and they wanted Russia to remain quiet. And following the summit meeting in Geneva between Presidents Putin and Biden, you actually, I think, saw some small positive steps in U.S.-Russia relations. You had a broadening of diplomatic contacts. Both sides, for example, were describing the strategic stability to dialogue in constructive terms. But what we saw was that Putin was not prepared to remain quiet. And I think despite its desire to focus on China, the Biden administration has done a very credible job in dealing with this Russia crisis, both in terms of outlining painful steps to try to deter and dissuade the Kremlin from military action or new military action against Ukraine, and also defining forward a dialogue to get out of this crisis. And my guess is that if they continue to handle this crisis well, it probably also helps their China approach, because it will be reassuring to American allies in the Pacific, Japan, Australia, South Korea. And also, I think it does send a strong message to the Chinese and may well affect their calculations about what they might do in the future, for example, with regard to Taiwan.
Okay, thank you. Charles, there's a question. I think it's about domestic politics in US. Robert Friedman is asking, internally, the US seems united on Ukraine, with the Republicans wanting tougher tactics. Is this not a loss for Putin, or did he miscalculate on US unity on Ukraine?
There is a little bit of divergence within the Republican Party. The what you might call the far right wing is saying, this is not our problem. We don't have an interest in Ukraine. Some in the Trump camp are still supportive of Putin, but I don't think it's a voice that especially with the Democrats in power, is consequential. And for the most part, standing up to Russia, pushing back against China, these are issues that share bipartisan support. And that bipartisanship is very hard to come by in the United States these days, but on Russia and China, it's there. And I think it's again, as we've been talking about, Putin is making it easier. Putin is taking steps that are pushing Democrats and Republicans together, pushing Europeans together, pushing the United States and its NATO allies together. And so there's definitely a problem here of self-encirclement. He keeps pushing, the circle gets tighter, and hopefully we can avoid a war, because I really do think it would be a game changer.
And we are almost done. Kadir, there is a specific question to you. I cannot read the name of the person. Ask Roy Goodman. For Kadir, what if anything can be done for the people of Crimea, in particular the Tatars? Is Crimea now under the Russian control forever?
Well, nothing is forever, as we've not learned, especially in this crisis. But Tatars, I think Turkey has been lobbying for their safety, for their sort of, for them not being harmed. Of course, Crimea's annexation was relatively less complex than the current crisis we are discussing, right? According to Putin, there was, there was a referendum there. Of course, there were thousands of Russian troops on the ground protecting the ballot box, where referendum was it's hard to call it a referendum, but anyway, he used that to annex Crimea. And Tatars are a big concern for Turkey, has been a concern for Turkey, and Turkish President Erdogan has lobbied on their behalf, make sure they're safe. Of course, the reversal of this annexation will probably require a lot of pressure. I don't know how realistic it is anytime soon. Probably it would have to be part of a much bigger deal, and I'm not sure Putin will give it up. We know from his example in the past, he hasn't given up anything like that. So I don't expect that, but it's important for for Turkey and others to maintain that this is not an acceptable sort of situation, and it's illegal, etc. So I think that's kind of what I can say about that, Coolidge.
Okay, I thought that that is the last question, but I got a last-minute question. I will ask to Steve and Charles. There are some and anonymous attendees asking, there are some rumors that Russia would seek militarization of Venezuela and Cuba in case NATO didn't accept Russian demands. Do you think Russia would go to that extent? And what could be the potential consequences that could be applied by the US? Steve, shall we start with you?
Yeah, my guess is that that's been raised just to try to create a little bit more angst in Washington. But I would expect that any Russian response in terms of militarization would be more in Europe, not in Cuba and Venezuela.
Charles?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's posturing. I think what he's trying to say is, if you come into my neighborhood, I'm going to come in to your neighborhood. And Russia has pushed out of late. It is in the Middle East. It is in Africa. But I think the idea of it sort of showing up in a geopolitically consequential way in the Western Hemisphere is a bit far-fetched. But I think it does piggyback on the degree to which China is involved in Central America, in South America, in the Caribbean, and not in a geopolitical way, i.e., the Chinese aren't yet opening bases and putting in weaponry, but they're increasing their geopolitical influence. And in some ways, the Russians are pretty good at piggybacking on that. But I think Steve's right. if we see militarization, it'll be in the Russian neighborhood. So far, we haven't seen Russia begin to move troops towards its western flank, up towards the Baltics. They are obviously putting troops in Belarus. But if there's a war in Ukraine, I do think you're going to see the kind of, not necessarily force levels that we saw in the Cold War, but a much more kind of tentative, dangerous situation in a geopolitically divided Europe.
And I would just note on that, I mean, if you go back to 1997, when NATO began the enlargement process, NATO said, in addition to there was no intention, no plan, no requirement to put nuclear weapons on the territory of new allies, but NATO also said that it saw no need for additional deployment of substantial combat forces on the territories of new allies that entered after 1997. And really from 97 up until 2014, you had no real NATO ground force presence in places like the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. I mean, there were exercises from time to time, actually quite small exercises, but what do you have now after the Russians went into and seized Crimea and then provoked the conflict in Donbass? You now have NATO multinational battalions in each of the three Baltic states and Poland. You have elements of an American armored combat brigade deployed in Poland, which will be reinforced by another 1,700 troops coming from the United States in the coming days. You have an American force in Romania, and it looks like the French will be deploying to Romania. And the British are now talking about bolstering NATO's presence in the Baltic states. So, the Russians have said they don't like this military presence. It's going up because of their actions. Now, Washington has made clear, I think, at least in some conversations, that these deployments would be temporary. And if this crisis ratchets it down, that can fall down. But if the Russians then respond by a further militarization, what they may well find is that they have more NATO forces closer to their borders than was the case before, 3 months ago, and certainly before the case was in 2014.
And I would just add that even after 2014, those deployments were in keeping with the NATO-Russia Founding Act. As you know, Steve, they're relatively small. We're talking about 1,000 or so in the Baltics. And the combat brigade that the US puts into Poland is on a rotational basis precisely because that founding act said no major combat forces stationed forward. Yeah. Now, would that likely change if Russia goes into Ukraine? I'm guessing the answer to that is yes.
Yeah. And at this point in time, I think all the NATO deployments, none are permanent. They're all what they call persistent rotating. But the White House has pretty much made clear, and going back to the first phone call or the video conference between President Biden and President Putin back on December 7, what the White House said was, look, if the Russians now use new military force against Ukraine, our allies on the eastern flank are going to be much more nervous, understandably, about possible Russian intentions. They will want more NATO force presence on their territory, and the United States and NATO will respond positively to that concern. You already, I think, are now seeing that begin to happen. Another victory for Russian policy.
I just want to add, Kılıç, quickly. I do agree that Putin may have miscalculated to some extent to how much mobilization could have occurred among NATO allies. But when we look at other conflicts, of course, not in Europe, in Libya, Syria, South Caucasus, elsewhere, he bides his time and then tries to find the next opportunity, and that might, I'm worried about that. But at this time, I agree, it has created this counterproductive, from his perspective, effect of pushing some non-NATO countries to talk about NATO membership, and then even increasing resolve among Ukrainians for NATO membership, or a good portion of them at least. But again, this also has implications for Biden's China policy, And I think China is following this very closely. Its moves, well, again, going back to my point about Biden being able to marshal the resources and create this united front, has implications for the Middle East and as well as China. I think that when America promises these things, can it deliver? That's being tested in many ways right now, and so far it's a passing grade. It's a good grade, but I'm just suspending my judgment about further what happens when there is a actual military conflict. As Charles said, U.S. already forswore that there won't be a military direct response by the U.S. So anyway, thanks.
And gentlemen, thank you very much. We can continue, I think, this conversation for the next 1 hour, but we have to stop here. Thanks for our viewers, and thanks for the audience. Thanks for those who are following us on Twitter and Facebook right now. And hopefully we will meet you again in another panel on the same crisis following President Erdogan's visit to Ukraine. We will inform you through our social media accounts. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And thank you for everyone again. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.